Good evening and welcome. This is the meeting number 8, 10-10 session for June 1-3. And we want to begin first of all by making some comments specific to our work on the packets, both the packets that I've returned to you as well as the packets that you'll be giving to me this evening. I've got, I suppose, not necessarily a linear way to do this. I've kind of got different ideas that I want to talk about, so I just will one at a time. You can kind of jot the ideas down as they come to you. First of all, I want to make real clear about the issues of MLA style book and attribution. Starting with the papers that I saw in my last round and now going forward, MLA style book becomes the central project for us in regards to the work that we're doing. Let's now get through some nomenclature, at least in the ways that we talk about it in here. Nomenclature, code language, the ways we talk about it in here. When we speak of attribution, citation, we're talking about the same thing. We have two kinds of validation of our papers. Internal validation is a term that I will use specifically to a literature course where a single text is the assigned text. For example, write on Milton's Paradise Lost. So if you're quoting from Paradise Lost to justify the ways of God to men, then you are citing from a particularly assigned text. Into that we would call that text internal validation. Okay. Everything else we will qualify as external validation, abbreviated as capital E, capital V. So when you see in your papers capital E, capital V, I am referencing external validation. That is to say, citation, attribution. Okay? Now, the first thing that we want to make sure of, and this is very fundamental, but I would maybe write it down just to remind myself. We're always looking for proper attribution in two places. One, in the body of the paper, text, in text citation, we reference it. Two, what we're doing on our works cited page at the end of the paper. Okay? So those have to always be there. Another way to say it, before you ever hand in a paper to me or any other prof, is the following. If it's listed on the works cited page, it must be properly attributed within the body of the paper. In other words, the very first citation on your works cited page, alphabetical order, last name first, right? Let's call it Alexander because it's a last name of A. Alexander is the very first of your citations. Alexander, that citation has to appear in the body of the paper. In other words, the name Alexander will either be part of the actual sentence where the citation reference exists, or it will be set off in parenthetics right after the information. Okay? So if it's on the works cited page, it must be cited somewhere in the body of the paper, and that has to be cleanly observed. Okay? Now, to aid us as a double check mechanism, you won't hand in any papers for me that are workshop papers, in other words, part of packets, without taking your red ink pen and identifying every time you have any kind of external validation. You will mark it in the right-hand margin as capital E, capital V. And you'll do this later this evening as you get ready to hand in a packet to me. We can even go one step further with red ink to make sure that we understand this is not MLA style book. This is just a way for us to double check that things are getting done. You can number on your works cited page in the left-hand margin with red ink 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to number your 5 pieces of required external validation. If you cite more than 5, that's fine. Just continue to number 6, 7, 8, whatever. Then, when you cite in the body of your paper the EV of Alexander, if Alexander is number 1 of your citations, you literally just write in red ink to the right in the margin EV number 1. What this allows for you to do is to double check to make sure that all of your pieces of external validation have some correlate in the body of the paper itself. Okay? It's a great way to check, to double check. Now I want to make an observation about creating papers, and now this is a typing thing. I'm going to give a couple of suggestions here that are just kind of backdooring the whole process of how you write one of these papers. These papers can be very labor intensive, but there are ways to shortcut. Let me give you a couple. One, they say the way to write a good paper is to find a good paper. Now think about what I just said. To write a good paper is to find a good paper, and by that I mean finding papers already written that have a good works cited page is a place for you to run down your research. If I'm writing a paper on the moon is made of cheese, and I find an academic paper with 17 references in which the argument of that paper is the moon is made of cheese, all I have to do is immediately go to those citation references on the works cited page, and I'm doing my research. Does that make sense? I mean, one way I could do this is to just go to the databases myself and to find that Alexander suggests the moon is made of cheese, right? I can find that myself, or I can go and find a paper by Dr. Overcast where he cites Alexander, and on his works cited page, Alexander is there. Then I can run down that citation myself and qualify that as a primary citation as opposed to a secondary citation. I could always quote Overcast quoting Dr. Alexander. I could do that. That's what we call a secondary citation, right? It's two removed. I'm quoting Overcast, quoting the primary source. But the better way is for me to go to Dr. Overcast's paper, run through his works cited page, find the quote I like, run down the original or primary quote, and now all of a sudden I don't have to do all of my work through databases. I have found the quote with the help of a good paper, Overcast, Dr. Overcast paper. So one of the things early on I recommend that you do is to learn how to read the papers that are already written on your topic. And begin then with academic papers that have a works cited page. Does that make sense, what I just said? If it has a works cited page, you can quickly run down that intel. Got me? 2, instead of working, and if you were formally trained early on in your academic career to do some kind of note-taking by hand, to do some kind of note cards and that kind of thing, I'm with you because, I mean, obviously I come out of that old school background as well. But I would suggest to you, you can do that without ever worrying about index cards by creating files on your computer that allow you to be very organized with the creation of your research. A couple of suggestions. Anytime you're working on a paper, create a folder for that paper. Within that folder, create a single document that will be your works cited document. Got me? Anytime you find information, and since most of you are working with databases and online, anytime you find information, immediately create the actual works cited page citation. Just create it. Got me? So that you're actually just creating what we will call a bibliography, a listing of all sources researched. Some of that you'll use, some of that you won't use, but you've got it all there. Got me? You can create then a second document that allows for that same information only amplified with whatever notes you're working with that you cut and paste right out of the information that you're finding in the database. Well, I thought that's plagiarism. No. Plagiarism is when you put it in your paper and don't properly attribute or cite it. But all I'm saying right now is you're building your paper. I find a great quote, for example, by Dr. Alexander, the moon is made of cheese. I type up a full, on my works cited page, the full citation. Then I cut and paste the quote into another file that I might have, which has all of my research there. It's the equivalent of making your little note cards. Make sense? Then, your third document within this folder is the actual paper itself that you're writing, right? And when you get to the quote on, the moon is made of cheese, according to Dr. Alexander, you just open up the other file, cut and paste, make your attribution. And now you know for sure that Dr. Alexander will be on that works cited page. But let's say that you find a similar quote by Dr. McAllister, and you don't quote from him ultimately. You just go onto the works cited page and you just get rid of Dr. McAllister. You still have that information on that second document that you created. So if you need later to go back, for example, and to use it later, you've got it. So it's a way to keep a paper trail so you can easily find what you were looking for. Notorious problem. Students are doing research. They find a great quote. They don't write it down and they don't write the source down. Or they do write the quote down but they don't write the source down. And then when they decide they want to use the quote, then they got to go through the whole process of finding the original source. That becomes major labor intensive. So being very methodical in your research will help you save energy and write these papers down the line. Make sense? And I would say saving everything you've got in backup mode allows for you to give some consideration to potential writing projects coming. So for example, if you're writing on an environmental issue in a 10-10 class, you might be able to resurrect that paper, not maybe in total. Remember, profs will constitute that as plagiarism if you use a paper from a 10-10 class and just immediately hand it in. But there's no rule against taking a paper you wrote in a 10-10 class and adapting it, right? Changing it in some ways so that you're never, guilty of the quote-unquote plagiarizing of an earlier paper of yourself, plagiarizing yourself. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but that's how profs kind of look at it. But if you've got it saved, you can quickly do that. By the way, one of the reasons you want to do that, and I'm already seeing this in some of the papers that you guys are using from papers that you wrote during your high school experience, is that right away, your papers can become very dated. And you're quoting things, for example, on a paper that you wrote in your junior year of high school, and now you're a freshman in college, and that's 2 or 3, sometimes 3 years later. And so you want to make sure that you're writing the most up-to-date kinds of information. One of the fast ways to do that is to take the information that you're citing, do a Google search, or go into the databases, and see if you can find the same thing said by a more current source. Right? You got the information, you basically just have to find the information said by somebody more currently. That's very easy to do now within our databases because we can do word searches, right? So you can take an idea, the moon is made of cheese, and you can find out what is the most current academic that I can quote. Well, I have somebody from 1989 that says the moon is made of cheese. And I have somebody from 1999 that says the moon is made of cheese. But I've also got a quote from 2012. I'm going to take the 2012 quote because it's more current. And that will help you in regards to your paper writing. Okay? 2, think about the fact that academic writing is built upon the notion of your thesis as being relational. Relational. Now, by that I mean what? And if you looked at the skeleton guide, which I'm going to suggest in a bit you really do want to do, you'll see there that the thesis is suggested to always be relational, and the way it's taught is A to B. Now when I use that kind of notion, what I mean is that all thesis writing for us, in arguable thesis writing, is relational. In other words, we're always relating one idea, let's call it A, to B. Okay? Now, in argument writing, especially this is the case. Now, if I'm simply writing about gun control, right, my thesis will, if I'm writing expository, my thesis will sound something like, there are multiple perspectives on the question of gun control, right? But notice that's still to some degree relational. There are multiple perspectives, can I just abbreviate, to the issue of gun control. See how that works? I'm always relating one idea to another idea. But in argument writing, think about, for example, the last paper, the one that I just saw for you. In argument writing, I definitely have some kind of perspective on an A, which we'll qualify as the fundamental argument, and then some B, which we'll qualify, for lack of a better term, as our opinion. Right? So, for example, if I'm writing on pro-choice is my argument in regards to my view of pro-choice as being a legitimate view, or vice versa if we're writing about the issue of abortion topic. The reason why the thesis needs to be understood as relational is so that all of our points of validation, 1, 2, 3, 4, however many they are, our topic sentences now become paramount. Let's point out something about profs who read your paper. Very regularly, profs will read your paper through what is sometimes referred to as sweeps. That is to say, there are certain things they're looking for as they work through the paper. With that in mind, you want to understand and this makes some sense if I say it this way. Dude, in a class of 25, 10, 20 students, literature class, if the prof has given everybody a paper on Hamlet, that's 25 papers on Hamlet. That prof is not just lecturing one class. That prof is lecturing usually 3 or 4 classes. If all of his classes number 20 to 25, and all of his classes students are writing papers, he can have up to 100 papers that he's looking at to read. Now the question obviously becomes, how closely will he scrutinize those papers? And the answer to that is often, early on, not very closely. In other words, what he does when he sits down to score is he has kind of 3 piles. Okay? The first pile is this paper ain't going to pass pile. That's the, for example, paper that's so poorly constructed with all kinds of grammatical errors or whatever, not even going to look at it. Or maybe, for example, he immediately identifies this is a copy and paste project. I'm just flunking this paper for plagiarism issues, blah, blah, blah. The second pile is going to be that kind of middle of the road, I see some problem. And then, of course, that third pile is going to be, I'm going to look very closely at these papers because clearly the time was given to these papers. You clearly want to be in the last 2 piles. How does this instructor make that first sweep? 2 things. The instructor looks first at this. If the instructor cannot find a clearly stated thesis, your paper is very quickly becoming a C or lower paper. There are 2 ways we set this thesis up so that we can say to the prof, yo, 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 look at me, look at me. I am playing the game well. I am telling you what my arguable thesis is. Even though you assigned me the topic of the 3 causes of the American Civil War, I still am going to tell you what the thesis is. 2 places I'm going to do that. 1, I'm going to do that in my academic title. That's why titles are so important. The creative title just sets it up. So you want to do something kind of cutesy-tootsy creative to show that you're not just a, boring academic. But your academic title that sits below that creative title, that's the title that matters. That's the title the prof's going to look at. That title must tell us what you're writing on. If you're writing on gun control, you definitely need to say that in that academic title. So a treatment of, a discussion of, an analysis of, whatever. That's the first place. So right away, the prof knows exactly what it is that you're working on. One of the reasons why, and I said this to several of your papers, so I'll mention it now. One of the reasons why, in your login information, you want to say the chapter of the book, of the paper that you're writing, and what the assignment is, proposing a solution, for example. You want to put that information here or here. MLA, I think, Stylebook puts it down on the left. You might want to check to see if they've not changed it again. Okay? The reason you're doing that is just for the convenience of the instructor. Think of it. If the instructor is reading multiple papers, right, of different kinds, then it makes sense that you want to make sure this instructor is reminded of what it is you're writing so that there's not any chance you get dinged. But then secondly, you providing that academic title lets the instructor know exactly what it is that you're writing on. If the assignment has been assigned collectively to the group, discuss in a well-written paper the 3 causes of the American Civil War, then you definitely are going to say that. A treatment of the 3 causes of the American Civil War. You want that academic title to be very straightforward and very boring. Okay? If you're writing in 1020, you're going to mention authors' names and texts. If you're, for example, having to write on Milton's Paradise Lost and a critique of the Theodicy of Milton in Paradise Lost, then you're going to say that. An analysis of the Theodicy of Milton in Paradise Lost. Okay? You have the author's name, you have the text you're going to be working with. But dude, he assigned me the paper. Right. But part of playing the game is to say back to the prof, I understand you've assigned me this topic, now I'm going to make it very clear what I'm writing on. Then in the introductory paragraph, you want this thesis then to be the centermost point of your paragraph or paragraphs. Now here's the thing, you don't ever get to write in the margins the word thesis and put big neon sign around it. So look at this is the thesis, thesis, thesis. Which is why we normally recommend the last sentence of your introductory paragraph or paragraphs is your thesis. Now in a traditional 5-paragraph essay, that's the last sentence of the first paragraph. Got me? You want that to be clear. And the reason I'm hammering this is because Several of you wrote papers for me in the last round. Dude, I could figure out what you were writing about. Okay, I could do it. But it took me too much time to figure out what you were writing about. This is as simple as asking 2 questions right now about that last paper I just handed back to you. 1, do I have an academic title? If you don't, you're already, for lack of a better phrase, torquing off the prof. You do not want to torque off the prof. 2, do I have a clearly stated thesis where I'm saying the 3 causes of the American Civil War are blah, 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 blah? Do I have that statement clear in my intro paragraph or paragraphs? If I don't, I got issues. I got trouble already. But then the next step is going to be looking at our topic sentences for your points of validation. Okay? Those topic sentences must have some element of your A and some element of your B in each one of your topic sentences. And that's got to be very, very clear. That's got to be very clear to the instructor. Here's why. In a first sweep of papers, regularly, profs will only read 4 sentences. They will read an academic title, and they will read 4 sentences. They will read your thesis, and they will read your 3 points of validation. Now, one of the ways that often we use to try and help make this happen, and I highly recommend that you do this for any paper you're handing in, for any prof from here on out, is to do what we call a thesis POVs page. By that I mean the following. When you finish your paper, you literally look at your paper. You've got your paper on one side of your screen. You open up another document. You literally cut and paste, copy and paste, right out of your paper, those 4 sentences. You hit the print key. You take that printout and hand it to somebody else, a third party. You literally say to them, I want you to scan this and tell me what my paper is about. Can you do that? If they can't do that, you're in trouble. Your writing has become something kind of convoluted. See, because check this out. Can I use this as an example? This is the way a lot of us write. Okay, dude, I'm going to talk about gun control for a while, and then, oh yeah, there's this story I was going to, oh yeah, and then there's this, oh yeah, there was this other thing I was going to, oh yeah, gun control. Okay. Then we hit the print key and we hand it in. Got me? And then we get this as our score back. Technically, I did write about gun control. I was all over the proverbial, the compositional map, but I did write about gun control. And if you want me to, with the prof, I can sit down and say, see, right there was point 1, and right there was point 2, and right there was point 3. I did everything you assigned to me to do. And the prof will say back to you, that is true, which is why I didn't fail this paper. However, what that prof's looking for is, I'm going to be writing on gun control. I have these observations I will be making. This linear, dare we call it in rhetoric, Aristotelian approach, that right there is what you're in a 10-10 class to learn how to do. See? And my job is to help you learn how to do that. Upside. I realize there's lots of downside. This is a lot funner to write, blah, blah, blah. Upside. Once you learn how to do this, you can do it. And then you can do it for any prof who demands it of you. Whether you're a student at Northwest or you're a student at Stanford. Doesn't matter. The expectation of the paper is identical. Doesn't matter. So one of the first things we'll look at then is this issue of the thesis and its relationship to your topic sentences. Okay? Which is to say, if you do a thesis topic sentence or POV printout, that relationship should be identifiable and clear. So we have a couple of rules. One of the big ones is we never cite or quote in the first sentence of paragraphs. Don't do it. Don't do it. But it's a creative way for me to set up my topic. That's this. But I like to give because we're playing a game where the instructor doesn't want to read 3 sentences to figure out what your next POV is. It's all about energy conservation. You getting me? You understand what I'm saying? Okay? So depending on what kind of place you are and the prof and that kind of thing, your profs will often do several sweeps of papers. So for example, sweep through the paper. If the paper doesn't have clearly identifiable thesis, topic sentences, POVs, usually the papers are getting jacked to D's or lower. Done. Unless you have a really gratuitous prof who will give you a 70 or a C or whatever. Okay? Then the profs will go back through and begin the process of closer reading to try to understand some of the nuances of the work. Usually second sweep has to do with looking closely at attribution issues and citation. How closely is that happening? How well is that done? Okay. And then finally, a third sweep of the paper, this is usually junior, senior level, unless you're working in an honors program, is starting to look at issues of style, all the stuff this guy's talking about. Can I take a kernel sentence and make it into something else? Blah, blah, blah. Got me? Okay, so what you're really wanting to focus on, and hey, I mean this, you've got to ask yourself, my natural proclivities may be this, I really got to work on this. I got it. Because if I don't learn how to do this, I'm wasting a lot of my money going to the university or the college of my choice. I just am. Because profs in the science department, the math department, the history department, whatever, psych department, they're going to give me papers, and if I can't do this and I do this, I'm going to end up with 70s on a lot of my papers, and I can't do that because I want good grades. Okay? And that's a huge difference between high school and college. Huge difference. When I take a high school science class, all I got to do is be really good at copying down overheads and taking multiple choice tests. When I take a science class at the university, I'm going to have to write a paper a lot of times. Right? Whole different project. With that in mind, follow the skeleton guide. Look at it, memorize it, internalize it, and never hand in a paper without a sense of that skeleton guide. About any of that skeleton guide, if you have questions, clearly ask me. But that skeleton guide is the central, most important page in that packet that I gave to you. I call it skeleton guide for a reason, because that's what it is, just a skeleton. Obviously, you're building lots onto it. But you want to be sure that you are following that guide to some degree. There will be nuances depending upon your instructor, but by and large, that's where you really want to make sure you at least understand the rules of the game. Okay? Finally, let's talk real quickly about some editing. This is a big dog deal. Dude, I give a lecture on agreement, and the agreement rule is broken in the first sentence of the paper. I give a lecture on comma splice and run-on sentence, and we make a comma splice or run-on sentence in the first sentence of the paper. Now look, my job as a 1010 instructor is to grow you. So I get to be compassionate. I get to point it out even with smiley faces. Ha ha, that's pretty funny. I give a lecture on agreement and you broke the rule in the first paragraph. Ha ha, that's funny. It ain't going to be funny to a psych prof who often won't even, are you ready for this? Won't even point it out. They won't circle the comma splice. They'll just give you a C on the paper. They often won't even reference that the paper is poorly edited or proofed or revised. Their view of it is simple. If you can't find a way to find your errors, the prof will say, I ain't getting paid the money to help you find your errors. A classic rendition of this is profs to say, you cannot afford me as a proofreader. Find a proofreader. Okay? Now on the 1010 level, my job is to walk a kind of middle of the road fine line. Okay? Where I will begin to point out some of your grammatical errors to you. The key is, you got to invent a system. Underline that word, a system where you are editing your papers. Let's say it out loud. Really hard to edit at all when you're writing an hour or two before deadline. That's like an it gets dark at night point, but I gotta say it. If your paper is due on the 12th of September and you're writing your paper on the 11th of September, you are not giving yourself any time for editing. You're just not. Virtually no time. Almost no time for revisions. So the system that you employ has got to begin by asking of yourself two questions. When is the paper due for me to hand it in? When will I finish the paper in draft 1 so I can begin the process of editing? Some of us have got to get very serious about this, or you're going to flush a lot of money in the academic community writing papers you're going to get 70s on. Got me? And I mean that. Now, you're going to dance with some profs that will not care. And then all of a sudden, you're going to hit an instructor that will say, really? You don't know how to take care of issues of agreement? If you're talking about person, you can't use they. You have to use he or she, him or her. Really? Were you not taught this? They often won't say that. They're just going to give you a 70 on the paper. if you want to go in and have a visit with them, they'll usually say something like, well, it wasn't really edited very closely, something like that, kind of general. Suggestions. One, I've already given to you. Using some kind of sweep understanding of your paper is a great suggestion for you. So sweep your paper looking for certain things. Don't try and just read through your paper finding all of the errors at once. Do just a comma sweep. Do just a sweep looking for NAS, not a sentence. Going over it and over it and over it. Let me suggest as well a site that a lot of students now are beginning to utilize called paperrater.com. Now this is free software, so let's just say out loud, you can't expect a lot from it. But we are in the age when technology is really working hard to become even better. And students are reporting that if used right, PaperRater can be a pretty good service. You can actually tell the software exact parameters for the paper. What, for example, classification? Is it a high school paper? Is it a college paper? Is it a graduate level paper? Etc., etc. What is the actual assignment? Is it a letter? Is it an essay? What kind of essay? Etc., etc. And then you simply put your paper into that software and you hit the submit button and it will actually score your paper for you. It will point out basic grammatical errors. It will suggest certain words maybe should be used instead of other words, etc., etc. I would highly recommend that you use PaperRater for any paper from here on out. Certainly for the rest of our 10-10 session, do it. Just use the software if nothing else, okay? Number two, when you hit Northwest College, the University of Wyoming, or wherever else you're going, there are online writing centers now. Both of those two institutions I just mentioned employ them, where you actually, and if you look at Northwest College's homepage, and I recommend you write down this to do this, you can actually find the writing center information there. It is a free service to you, okay? Using your student ID, you are allowed to actually use this free service. Where? If you give them enough time, and I think they need a day, so if the paper is due on the 14th, you probably should hand it in to them on the 12th to give them the one day to the 13th so they can get it back to you. They actually physically, human eyes will read your paper and will then come back with suggestions, ways to improve your paper. And I highly, highly recommend you do that. It is a great, great fallback when profs start trying to nail your papers for saying, you know, it's just weakly written. You can always say, well, I sent it to our writing center and they evaluated it and I made the suggestions that they made. Can I have other suggestions from you? Now that puts the prof at least in a position where she has to tell you some things from your paper other than I just didn't like it. She can actually give you some positive suggestions on how to improve your papers for papers that are coming. Okay? Finally, I highly recommend you utilize each other. Think of it this way. You are in a community of like-minded scholars now. So any paper that you're writing, highly recommend send it or email it to each other. Will you look at my paper if I look at yours? And then start to try and find each other's errors, beginning with the big picture and then going to the smaller stuff, right? The grammar stuff, the wording, and all that kind of stuff. Let me give you a simple example of ways to improve your paper. When you provide attribution, the natural tendency is to stick with a single verb, namely said, right? Or says, right? So Dr. Alexander says that the moon is made of cheese, okay? That little verb says is an easy setup, right? Now, I recommend when you write your paper the first time, just use says all the way through. But then I recommend on an editing of your paper to go back and to begin to look at those setup attribution verbs and change them, vary them. Dr. Alexander reports, Dr. Alexander suggests, Dr. Alexander implies, Dr. Alexander, you can use a thesaurus to keep going. But I recommend that you do some of that kind of work to vary the stylistic approach in terms of attribution stuff, okay? Now, I've given you a number of ideas. Hopefully you've written some of them down, and then you're going to check them off or whatever as you get ready for the next papers. Do you have any questions for me, specific in nature? Okay, let's now go to day planners real quickly. And